I guess we'll just kind of start with in your research, if someone coming in, who is Butler and who is Turpin as far as the families?
Yeah, so General Butler is probably the most famous of the family, W.O. Butler. He was a general in the Mexican-American War. And his family, he was the son of a man named Percival Butler, who had moved to Gallatin County around like 1795, bought a parcel of land in what is now Carrollton, and started a farm and brought with him his wife, a number of enslaved people, and then a number of his own children. And that farm eventually became what is the General Butler State Park.
Okay.
And so it went through Percival Butler. When he died, he just split it between all of his kids. And so they each got a portion of it. And then W.O. Butler eventually came in and bought all of his siblings' rights to it. And then in the late 1850s, his Percival Butler's granddaughter, W.O. Butler's niece, Mary Ellen, and her husband, Philip Turpin, moved from Gallatin County near Sparta, Glencoe area, and bought a portion of this land and moved down there and built this house. And that's the house that is on General Butler now.
So what is now the state park was essentially the whole family farm then?
Yeah.
So that's like 8,000 acres. I mean, it's really big.
No, it's like 125 acres. Yeah.
I'm way off. Okay.
I don't know if the state has like since then added some to that, but that's the kind of the heart of the state park.
But the fact it was able to kind of stay that in the family and for a number of...
Yeah, it left the family in like 1880 when Philip Turpin decided that he would move to Louisville, and then they actually ended up in Corpus Christi, Texas, because almost everybody in the family had tuberculosis, and they thought that it would be better for their health to live down there, and that's where he died. But then actually, if you fast forward just 50 more years, that site becomes Kentucky's 6th state park in 1931. So they're coming up on...
Did the family still own that?
They didn't. They sold it to a family called the Whiteheads.
Okay.
And I'm not sure how long the Whiteheads owned it, if the state park happened right after the Whiteheads or if there was another owner in that period.
Okay, so that's the kind of the background on the family. And then you started getting into slavery as far as who lived there and trying to track down the information of where these people... their names and who was on the land and for such as that? Okay.
Yeah. And so I started initially just with trying to find people who had been enslaved by Philip O. Turpin and his wife, Mary Ellen, because that is actually like those are the people who were tied to that house. But then I realized that the site goes back much further in the Butler family than that. So I really needed to be looking at all of the Butlers. And then once I did that, I was like, well, I really need to look at the other Turpins too. And that's what pulled me up into Gallatin County.
And so, I don't want to say lucky, but you got lucky in that this Baptist church had the records.
Yes.
And that they'd been maintained since the 1800s.
Yeah, that's the rare part, the fact that they're still around, because there were a couple churches in Carrollton, which was Port William at the time, that date from that period, but they've almost exclusively lost all of their records, either from flooding or churches like closing and going out of business, and the records just, who knows what happened to them. So the fact that these still exist was just a windfall. I
mean, yeah. So, and now when you say records, what are we talking about? What does that look like?
They're church minutes. And before I say anything about this, like, the fact that they're Baptist church minutes is significant because of all of the denominations in the American Christian expression. The ones that attracted Black and enslaved members early on are the Methodists and the Baptists. And actually, like, getting up into the 1840s and 50s, the American Baptists actually split over the topic of slavery because they always had allowed enslaved members into the church, but eventually some of the white members were like, we really should be like abolitionists and we shouldn't be supporting slavery, and others disagreed with that.
Okay, so you start researching, and then your first hit getting a name? Was that kind of what started it? Okay.
So the names that I was able to pull out of the Gent First Baptist Church minutes were kind of like my seed that I started with, and I ended up getting really lucky because some of these people a number of these people actually were just the handful of people over the years who were able to get emancipated before the Civil War.
Right.
And, you know, obviously if somebody becomes a free person in the 1830s, they can then own property. And that's where you start to actually like be able to sink your teeth into really good documents. And so at least two of the people who appeared in those church minutes were manumitted or voluntarily freed by the Butlers.
So at that time, that was part of Gallatin County,
Yes.
right? And so, but the courthouse and all that would have been what is now Carrollton?
Yeah, Port William
Okay.
was the kind of like the capital of
Okay.
Gallatin County. In 1838, the county split into Gallatin and Carroll, and I think at that point they designated Warsaw as the county seat.
And so then, I guess the documents that should have been in Carroll stayed in Carroll, and the rest
They
came down to Warsaw?
Didn't. No.
Okay.
They ended up in Warsaw.
Okay.
I think because Gallatin County kept the name.
So then once it's 1838, that would stay in Carroll County. Did that get easier to research that part of it later on?
Yeah, everything's at the courthouse. The documents that they have are great. It's just, unless you're a property owner, if you are a free Black person during that period of Kentucky's history, you may not really show up in very many records because most of the records are marriages, and the free population at its largest point before the end of slavery in Carrollton was like 17 Black people.
Okay.
So you have a very small pool of people who you can pick from. And so like Black people could marry if they were both free. Slave marriages were not honored legally. And so there's no documentation with that. There's sometimes some scant birth records in the 1850s,
Right.
and those can be helpful. But unless somebody's like either getting in trouble with the law and showing up in court records, which I did have a couple of those, or buying and selling property, there
Okay.
just may not be very much out there.
So those are the easiest ways to get included in a record and
Yeah.
stuff. Okay, so then as you move forward, I guess how forward did you take this with the research and information?
Some of the people, I went as far forward as I could. Some of the people I made it into like the 1940s and 50s with their descendants, and then kind of stopped.
Okay.
I should say there were like 10 people who got emancipated fairly early on from that whole block of people. One of them was here in Gallatin County, and he stayed in Warsaw, and a number of his descendants stayed around here.
Okay.
And then also moved up into Indiana, but he was a Turpin, enslaved man. But then on the Butler side, some of them went all the way to Canada. And so I followed them as far as I could. But once you get into Canada, there are only so many records you can access from America.
So, I guess at the peak, how many people lived in the what is now General Butler State Park in that area?
At the largest point in time, I think there were about 22 enslaved people there.
Okay.
So one of the really good resources if you're trying to look at a site and trying to kind of look at this history is tax records. Because in the period before the Civil War, in these areas at least, people paid taxes on the people who they enslaved. And so they're split usually into 16 and under and over 16. And so you get like a group number, and then you kind of get a little bit of like rough demographics there in terms of age.
So you took it all the way to the 1940s, which is really, must have been exciting.
Yeah. And there are some of these people out there who have descendants who are living now in places like Michigan and probably Indiana as well.
Did any stay in the area then, or did everyone kind of?
So most of the people left the area, and a lot of that had to do with what happened after the Civil War and how bad the Reconstruction era was here, and Jim Crow if you were African American.
So just chasing opportunity.
Yeah.
So-
And, like everyone's heard of the Great Migration. That started like before the Civil War here. A lot of people who became emancipated earlier on decided to get out of here and made their way up to Detroit because it's basically due north from here.
Right. So there wasn't one area. I mean, people through the 80 years, it just spread out.
Yeah.
Through and stuff. So I guess what is a takeaway from this research that surprised you, or?
I think, just every single story of an individual that I was able to uncover for me was really meaningful and really poignant, because these are people who probably nobody remembers or talks about now, even if they do have descendants. And the immense courage that a lot of them showed, and the perseverance and just like kind of slogging through slavery and then
Right.
all of the awful things that came after that was really meaningful to me. The other thing was, like, going into this, I was not really sure that I was going to find anything.
Yeah.
And the wealth of information that I was able to turn up was just staggering. Like, I came up with 110 names of people who I was able to actually ascribe a name to, who were enslaved by either the Turpins in Gallatin County or in Carroll County, or the Butlers in Carroll County.
And that was like over 40 years, roughly?
It's basically 1795 to
Oh, okay.
1865. Yeah,
Okay.
it's a little bit longer than that.
Because when the family started in, what is Gallatin at that time?
Yeah.
And then before they moved. So they had slaves with them before they moved?
Yes, so that's part of the puzzle with their interpretation at General Butler. They kind of have had this oral tradition that they're not really sure where it came from, that like Percival Butler came here with enslaved people, and then 3 generations of the Butler family lived on the site, accompanied by 3 generations of those enslaved people.
Okay.
And so part of what I was trying to do was verify whether or not that was actually true, or whether there was like buying and selling of people going on in there. But if you're looking at the Turpin side of things, the Turpins came later. They came in like 1822, I think. And they moved to Sparta, right where the Speedway is, actually.
Did they have that on the site, slave quarters?
So that's one of the interesting things. They have done multiple archaeological digs trying to figure out over the years where the slave quarters were on the property. And after reading through some really good oral resources from one of the children who grew up on the property, one of the Turpin children, and then a niece of the Butlers who visited the property, and then looking at the census records, it was the kitchen. The kitchen had like a basement and a loft, and those were the slave quarters.
Wow.
Yeah.
Sounds like a lot of people.
Yeah, there were 15 in 1860, and they all would have lived there, and probably some in the attic of the house.
Wow.
But it would have been pretty tight.
Yeah.
When you consider the fact that there were probably only like 6 or 7 people in the main house.
So did they just not want to tie up land? Or, I mean, because that's not orthodox, right? That's not
Yeah,
typical.
it's kind of odd.
Okay.
I don't know what the reason is behind it. There is a really good newspaper article that I found that talks about the Turpin farm out here in Gallatin County in Sparta Beach Park, and it was written by the daughter of the man who bought the property from the Turpins. He demolished the house and built a new house that's still there. But his daughter was a really little girl at the time, and when she was an old woman, she gave this interview. When she talked about when they bought the house, she said, like, we came through the central hall, and when you looked out the back door, there was just a row of slave cabins behind the house. And that's not really typical for this area. That's like much more Virginia slavery.
Interesting.
And I think, I mean, the Turpins moved from Virginia, and so I think
So they
they were
picked it
just still very Virginian.
Was it a concern, obviously, being on the river, of runaway and issues like that?
Yeah. Okay. That was a really big question I had going into this, and I found some really interesting answers to this. So going into this, I was like, surely there were a number of enslaved people who just sought their own freedom because they can see Indiana, it's a free state after the 18 teens. And I got some really mixed answers with this. So starting in like the 18 teens, 1820s, Carrollton is a huge, huge crossing over point for people who are running from the deep South and trying to get to freedom. And before the Fugitive Slave Act passed in 1850, all they had to do was get to a free state, and they would be free by the rules of those state. But in 1850, when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, it became legal for slave catchers to pursue an enslaved person into any free state, capture them, take them back. And so at that point, if you are seeking your freedom, you've got to go to Canada. But it's still a big crossing over point. But I read a lot of WPA interviews, and there was a really good one that was actually out of Mason County, near Maysville. And it was a man who had worked as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. He was enslaved. He lived on a farm outside Maysville, and he had a good bit of leeway that his enslaver gave him to use a canoe to go up and kind of go courting at different farms along the river. And one night while he was doing that, a woman opened her door and was like, "Hey, come here." And so he went up, and she was like, "Look, I have this little girl here, and she needs to get to the other side of the river, and won't you take her?" And he knew exactly what she was asking. It was a white woman, and the little girl was black, and he knew what he was doing. But eventually he didn't do it initially, but the next night he went back and he decided that he would take her across. And when he got to the other side, he said a man reached down and grabbed his shoulder, and he thought he was going to get like beat. And the guy said, "Hey, do you want some food?" And he was like, that was the first time I realized that it was not, on this side of the river, it was not the way that it was over in Kentucky. And so I don't know that there was, I think that there was probably talk about Indiana being free, but I don't know that it was generally realized by everybody.
Okay.
Which I found really interesting.
Yeah, especially how close it is.
Yeah.
And then, there was times back when the Ohio, you could cross it.
Yeah, right. I know. I didn't realize that until I did this too.
How much damming and it's made a difference on the Ohio River as far as...
Yeah, I know. I always thought about these riverboats going up and down the river, and you can't do that for part of the year in the 1840s.
Yeah. So that's just kind of interesting, that they'd be so close.
I know. It was shocking to me. But like, when you think about these people, if the amount of freedom you have within the bonds of slavery as an enslaved person really depended on what your enslaver decided you could do and could have. And so like, you might not be able to leave this 10 square mile area. If that's the case, like, you may not just know things that we would assume to be general information, or you may be allowed to take a canoe up and down the Ohio River. It's just, really personalized and individual.
So after the war, obviously, after the Civil War, everything's different. Everything's changed immediately. Yeah. Does the farm continue, or does it immediately kind of fall apart without the slave labor?
No, they continue. They hire on workers. And so the 1870 census is the first census after emancipation. And so that gives you a really good glimpse into the kind of jobs that people who are hired workers on the farm are doing. And I think can give you an inkling of some jobs that people who were enslaved were doing before the war. And so they have I think they've got 7 hired workers who are living on the farm still, probably in the slave quarters.
Okay.
And there are, I think, 2 or 3 farm laborers. There's a woman who is a cook. There's a boy who's a waiter boy, so he's probably just waiting the table and then doing odd jobs. And then there's a house girl who's probably taking care of fireplaces and doing a lot of cleaning. And she's like 12 or 13, so she's very, very young. And then there's a child of, 2 of them are a couple, and they've got like a 1-year-old child. Yeah. So the farm did continue, and they really leaned more heavily into animals and away from tobacco after that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's some resilience as far as what has been going on that land for 70, 80 years.
Yeah, and I think that there was some tenant farming that ended up happening after the 1880s and 1890s. But the house was pretty much abandoned by the 19-teens and 20s.
Just too big, too...
Yeah, and this happened a lot. Like, I don't know the exact details of what the house was being used for here, but I've worked at a lot of sites where these great houses became like hay ricks, and they would just keep hay in there and let the goats go in and eat and have chickens running around. So I imagine it was probably something similar to that by that point.
Well, I suppose without all the staff to help.
Well, yeah, and by the 19-teens, the South has really fallen into some economic hard times.
Right. Mm-hmm. So I guess, how long did you work on this project?
3 months. Okay. 3.5 months, yeah.
And so and we're starting off, so this was part of America 250.
Yes.
And it was commissioned by the state?
Yeah.
to research this, because it was just something that hadn't been researched? Or
Yeah. So, like I said, this was Kentucky's 6th state park to become a state park. It has almost been a state park for 100 years at this point. And I talked to this one woman who had been a docent there a while ago, and she's like, I never even considered that they might have enslaved people here. Like, it never even crossed my mind. So it was like this huge portion of the story that was missing, to the point where like people who worked there didn't even like question it or think about it. And so I think it was something that was on their radar for a while, and they really wanted to try to see if there was more to that side of the story.
So I guess, so you do your research and I guess you submit it, that what you discovered, and you
I gave them a jump drive.
Yeah, this is it.
I did a presentation on it, and I still have like 2 more presentations that I'll do on it.
Yeah.
But that was one of the reasons why I really wanted to do this, is just to try to get this information out and have it become more of the local part of the story and general knowledge.
Well, and it's interesting to me, just just barely getting into this, but just obviously a little bit of the story of how the county was split. That's something where you just, if you're here, you wouldn't think of, and that, how that changed the dynamic. But also, too, I find it interesting how they sent all the records over here. Mm-hmm. That would now be a big part of Carroll County. We'd have all the records. So that's kind of interesting on that. But then also, too, of like how the family's going from Sparta to just even in kind of getting in the weeds on this in like Warsaw, because until the 1930s, the courthouse faced the river. And so what a different mindset that is when the river was the highway.
Yeah.
And now it's not obviously like that. So it's just a completely different way of how this town was. And that's just within the last 100 years of how, and I'm sure, Carroll County is the same way. So it's just, these are just a lot of big subtle changes, if that makes any sense.
So one of the things that when I started to really dig into this, that really like I got kind of fixated on and interested in, was Eagle Creek is the area where the Turpins had their farms, and they had like thousands and thousands of acres. And when Horatio Turpin died in 1824, I think, he split all this land up between his children. And so Philip Turpin had his first house that he built out on Eagle Creek, and but it was all the way in Glencoe, pretty much, not Sparta, which is a pretty good distance. And so I went through all of this stuff on Eagle Creek, and I kept seeing things about how people would say, oh, Eagle Creek is navigable. It's a navigable river. And then other times people would be like, whoever said this is crazy. And so it's like they're still thinking about this creek as transportation and a highway to get out to the Ohio. But that's one of the reasons the 2 rivers, the Kentucky and the Ohio, are one of the reasons that Carrollton really became a hub for the Underground Railroad, is you've got these 2 easy ways for people to travel, and they converge right there at Carrollton.
Right. And so was there other, I know it's not quite the word plantations, but any farms that were similar to how the General Butler State Park was at the same time? So my point is, there's
of them. Yeah.
In that area, there's a lot going on too.
Oh yes. The Turpins, I would say, are wealthier and living on a higher scale than most of their neighbors. I went through a lot of census records and looked at the occupations that hired people were doing in the 1870s to try to kind of figure out how high people were living.
Right.
And the Turpins, Jesse Bright, he was the like state attorney general for Indiana and was kicked out during the Civil War because he was pro-Confederate and gave weapons to the Confederates.
Okay.
He's a brother-in-law of P.O. Turpin. He moved into Carroll County. And then there's one other family who's living kind of on the same level as the Turpins, but they're definitely the kind of the aristocracy, I think, of the region.
Okay. It's really interesting stuff. I mean, as far as just how it changed, but then also, if you know that information, you still see probably property lines that are still the same as they were 200 years ago and stuff like that too.
Yeah.
And how roads and, some things just don't change as far as that goes, as far as telling that story. What's next for you?
Well, I actually have my own business. I do restoration work on old buildings. I do faux finishes and stuff. So I kind of took a break doing that to do this because I had a shoulder injury, but I'm back to doing that.
So where do you work at? Where have you done some restorations at?
Belmont Mansion in Nashville is one big place. I work a lot at Whitehall Plantation up in Yellow Springs, Ohio. Rattle and Snap down in Murray County in Tennessee. And
so you're all over.
Yeah, I'm all over the place. Yeah.
So what makes this an important part of American history to be telling and retelling and learning about?
I have thought about this a lot, especially with how sensitive people get a lot of times to talking about difficult history and saying that by talking about it, you're trying to make people not feel good about the place that they come from or hate America. And I do not think that's true at all. I think, especially if you live in an area, the more you know about the people who came before you and the more you know about a place, the stronger a connection you have with it. I have found that to be true in every place that I have worked and really done like deep research like this. So I think that's one side of it. I just also think that there's something so profoundly humiliating and also, I don't know, like this tie that you get by learning about people who have gone through really hard times before you and looking at their lives. Part of like, it's just, we're all part of humanity and we're all part of this vast group of people that we might seem really different, but we have so many shared experiences. And so I think that from learning about the lives of these people, I mean, I feel like I've learned a lot about just like the human condition and the ways that people can persevere and rise above the situations that they're born into, and also the terrible things that we can do to each other as people.